Chapter 1. The Hand That Gripped Nothing. It was in the last bloom of summer that Hercule Poirot found himself summoned, with no small degree of reluctance, to a gathering at Grange Hall, a secluded manor tucked between the lavender hills and heavy hedgerows of Somerset. The occasion was the 50th birthday celebration of Lady Eugenia Gifford, a patroness of the arts and widow of the late steel magnate Oswald Gifford, whose fortune had built half of Western England's rail bridges. Poirot had not intended to accept. Retirement was a thing to be savored, not interrupted. But Lady Eugenia's letter, signed in violet ink and sealed with a trembling wax monogram, had piqued his interest. And so he came. It was not merely the elegance of the manor, with its white stone lions and ivy-laced colonnades, nor the absurd pageantry of its arriving guests, society painters with cravats askew, literary darlings trailing opium whispers, and foreign investors with polished smiles that stirred Poirot's senses. No, it was the unease in the air, the tension one feels in a perfectly painted portrait where something, barely perceptible, is out of place. It began with a scream. High and sudden, it sliced through the hush of the drawing-room, silencing the gramophone mid-waltz. Guests froze, cups trembled in saucers. Then came the thunder of footsteps on oak floors, a rush of servants, and finally, the sharp snap of a door swinging open. Poirot, having just declined a third helping of lemon tart, rose silently and followed the sound with the calm urgency of a man who had danced with violence before. The room in question was the Blue Study, so named not for its furnishings, which were predominantly mahogany, but for the melancholy paintings hung in silver frames along its walls. In the center of the room stood Lady Eugenia herself, pale as the linen curtains, and pressing a trembling hand to her temple. By the hearth, sprawled awkwardly with his face turned away from the light, lay a man. His right hand was clenched tightly around nothing, fingers curved inward as if holding some invisible, impossible object. There was no blood, no wound. But the silence in the room was the kind that follows only after something dreadful has occurred. Colonel Rupert Talbot, retired, barrel-chested, and red-faced from an ill-advised number of brandies, was the first to speak. "Good God, it's Harold. He's dead, isn't he?" Poirot stepped forward. "Let us not jump to the conclusion, Colonel. Let us first observe." He knelt by the body of Harold Fielding, an estate lawyer of no great renown but well known in this circle for being indispensable, discreet, and deeply embedded in the affairs of Lady Eugenia's fortune. His eyes were open, his jaw slack. Poirot gently pried open the clenched fist and found it empty. Nothing. No weapon, no paper, not even a strand of thread. Yet the force with which it had gripped at the void hinted at something far more deliberate than death in sleep. A whisper rustled from the doorway. What was he holding? Poirot did not turn. "That, madame, is a question we shall very much need to answer." A search was conducted with haste and unease. No sign of struggle, no note. Nothing missing, at least not visibly. But one item, Poirot noted with quiet attention, was slightly ajar on the mantelpiece. A miniature clock, silver and glass, tilted 5 degrees off-center. He adjusted it, almost ceremonially, and let his gaze pass over the bookshelves, the ashtray that had not been emptied, the second brandy glass still warm. By now, the other guests had begun to murmur. Some whispered behind silk fans, others paced nervously, searching for reason in absurdity. Poirot straightened, brushed a fleck of dust from his sleeve, and addressed them all. "Messieurs, mesdames, a man has died tonight, suddenly, silently, without violence to the body. But make no mistake, this is not a natural death." The murmurs swelled. Poirot continued, his voice crisp. "The hand that gripped nothing, gripped something once, something so important, so shocking, that it killed him. Perhaps not by bullet or blade, but by a truth revealed too late." From the back of the room, a soft voice broke the silence. It was Miss Lenora Vale, a rising pianist with eyes like twilight and fingers perpetually trembling. "He said something to me earlier. I didn't think anything of it, but now—" Poirot turned. "Yes, mademoiselle. He said he was afraid someone would silence him, that there were things he had learned that were too dangerous to document. I assumed it was gossip." "No," murmured Poirot. "It was confession. That night, the manor was locked. The telephone lines, already faint in stormy weather, were made unusable by the butler under Poirot's order. No one would leave, not yet. He would speak to each of them. He would learn their secrets not by brute force, but by precision. For someone among them had stolen a truth so sharp it had killed a man before he could speak it aloud. And thus began the affair at Grange Hall, the mystery of the hand that gripped nothing, and the mind that would see through everything. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The blue study remained closed for the rest of the evening. A constable from the nearby village of Dunworthy had arrived, red-cheeked and breathless, summoned by a stable boy sent sprinting through the storm-slick fields. His presence was more ceremonial than effective. He lacked both training and authority to interfere with Poirot, whose reputation had preceded him even in these remote corners of Somerset. The guests had retreated uneasily to the drawing-room, where the fire now crackled with forced cheer and glasses were filled more frequently than before. The illusion of civility, Poirot noted, was a desperate defense against fear. But beneath the clinking of crystal and murmured speculation, he observed the details that mattered. Lady Eugenia stood stiffly near the hearth, arms crossed against her body, speaking in low tones with her niece, Miss Penelope Gifford, a pale, angular woman with clever eyes and a voice always edged with irony. Colonel Talbot had planted himself near the drinks trolley and hadn't moved since. The pianist, Lenora Vale, kept glancing toward the hallway, her fingers twitching at her sides as though rehearsing a silent etude. And in the far corner, alone on a velvet settee, sat Jasper Knox, the family's financial adviser, absorbed in the ritual of rolling a cigarette with excessive precision. Poirot's gaze flicked between them all, but he spoke to none of them yet. He returned to the blue study just after midnight. The body had been removed respectfully under Poirot's eye and laid in one of the guest chambers, awaiting the coroner's arrival in the morning. But now, in solitude, Poirot examined the room as if it were alive, breathing its final secrets into the silence. There was something unsettling about the stillness. Not merely the absence of life, but the lack of disruption. The brandy glasses. One empty, one half full. A small, sharp crease in the carpet. A chair not quite aligned with the others. A framed photograph on the desk, turned just a few degrees inward. And the clock on the mantelpiece, now properly centered, had been adjusted by precisely 5 minutes. Poirot remembered its original position with the precision of a man who had once rearranged the cutlery of an entire dinner table to diagnose a theft. He knelt beside the fireplace. A faint, near-invisible smear of something oily marred the edge of the hearth. He touched it with a gloved finger, brought it close to his nose. It smelled faintly of almonds, an odor both innocent and deadly. Cyanide, perhaps? But no signs of ingestion. And the hand, The hand had gripped something desperately, something unseen. On the desk, a blotter had a single, fresh impression. No letter beneath, just the outline of what might have been a short note or phrase. Poirot tilted the reading lamp, examining the pressure marks in the paper. He would need graphite powder to lift the impressions properly, but for now he took note of the shape. A looped G, perhaps. An L. No, likely the beginning of a name. Not finished, not signed. He opened the desk drawers. They were oddly clean, immaculate, in fact. No dust, no loose paper clips, no spare ink nibs. He lifted the inkwell. It was half full. Yet the nib of the pen was dry. The man had been about to write, or had written something, and destroyed it immediately. But why? Poirot turned his attention to the room's only window. It had been opened at some point. The faint outline of rain splatter on the sill suggested it. But it was now closed, latched. A quick check of the floorboards beneath revealed a faint, wet patch in the rug. Someone had either entered or left through it during the rain, moments before or after Harold's death. He allowed himself a small smile. The scene was whispering now. At breakfast the next morning, the atmosphere was funereal. The guests gathered under a fragile veneer of normalcy. Conversations were fragmented. Eyes darted toward the empty chair at the table's end where Harold had always sat. Poirot took his seat near the head, beside Lady Eugenia, who wore black already, though the morning sun had barely cleared the hills. "My dear lady," Poirot began gently, "forgive my insistence, but I must ask you a few questions. Delicate ones, if you please." She nodded, lifting her coffee cup with an unsteady hand. "I will answer anything you ask, Monsieur Poirot. Harold was more than my legal counsel. He was my friend. When was the last time you spoke with him?" "Yesterday evening, just before dinner. He asked for a private word. He was troubled. He mentioned finding something unsettling among my late husband's personal files." "And did he say what it was?" "No, only that he feared it would cause a great deal of pain if revealed, and that he had to confirm a few things before speaking further." Poirot inclined his head. "And was anyone else aware of this?" Her eyes flicked toward Penelope. "He may have spoken to my niece. She and Harold, well, they had a closeness. Not romantic, I think, but a strange intimacy. She knew him better than most." At that moment, Penelope Gifford rose from the other side of the table, her voice clear. "He did speak to me, briefly. He asked whether I remembered something from when I was a child, a name, or perhaps an incident. But he was vague, distracted." "What name?" Poirot asked, turning to her fully. "I don't recall. He mentioned the ledger and the red ribbon. It made no sense." Poirot's brows lifted. A ledger, a ribbon. A document once bound, perhaps once hidden. The investigation had only just begun, but already Poirot felt the subtle pull of truths buried beneath layers of silence. There was a document, likely once grasped in Harold Fielding's hand, now missing. There was a window opened during the storm. There was the almond scent, the dry pen, the turned photograph, and the clock moved just 5 minutes forward. And most of all, there was a hand that had gripped nothing, and yet, perhaps, revealed everything. Poirot folded his napkin neatly. It was time to examine the other guests. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects Grange Hall had taken on the atmosphere of a stage after a final curtain. The actors left lingering amid discarded lines and forgotten intentions. A death had occurred, a quiet, unnerving one. And now Poirot, the only man capable of deciphering the performance behind it, began his most delicate task, identifying the players and discerning who had something to lose. The drawing-room was converted into a temporary parlor of inquiry. Poirot, ever precise, requested the suspects assemble there after breakfast, not as a dramatic gesture, but to observe them in proximity, to see how eyes shifted, voices faltered, and alliances surfaced when proximity forced silence to become tension. They came slowly, in order of importance, or perhaps of guilt. First was Miss Penelope Gifford, Lady Eugenia's niece and heir presumptive, seated at the window, tapping a cigarette against her thumbnail. She wore black, but not out of mourning. It suited her aesthetic. Poirot had observed her sharpness already, not just of wit, but of calculation. A woman well aware of money, inheritance, and the politics of grief. Next was Colonel Rupert Talbot, whose mustache rivaled Poirot's in ambition, if not discipline. His loyalty to Lady Eugenia was absolute, though his judgment was dulled by Scotch and sentiment. He had served with her late husband in Egypt and, since Oswald's death, had remained as a kind of unofficial guardian of the household. But Poirot noted his military certainty masked a vague disquiet. Colonel Talbot did not like mysteries. They made him feel powerless. Then entered Miss Lenora Vale, the pianist, trailing a scarf like a veil. She was not family, merely an artist in residence, invited as a favor by Penelope, who funded a small arts fellowship in Bath. She had been seen speaking quietly with Harold Fielding more than once, and her sadness this morning was less formal than the others. It clung to her like perfume, unpretentious and immediate. After her came Jasper Knox, the family's financial adviser. A thin man with dry hands and eyes that flicked between faces before settling on his lapel. Jasper had handled the restructuring of Lady Eugenia's fortune after Oswald's death, and he had once been Fielding's legal adversary in a land dispute. Poirot noted the tension in the handshake they had exchanged the night before. Two others followed. Mrs. Merrill Ashcroft, the housekeeper of 20 years, stoic and silent, her eyes never resting long on Poirot, and Mr. Elliot Crane, the hall's groundskeeper, who entered with the gait of someone dragged from routine into theater. He had little to say, and yet Poirot suspected he heard more than he let on. Once they were seated, Poirot remained standing. His stature, modest in height, yet imposing in stillness, commanded attention. He folded his hands. "Mes amis," he began, "we are gathered not for accusation, but for observation. One among us has seen something, said something, or done something that matters deeply to the death of Mr. Harold Fielding. Until we uncover the truth, we must be honest. Brutally so." There was a shuffle of discomfort, but no protest. "Let us begin with a question most simple," Poirot said. "Where was each of you between the hours of 10 and 11 last night?" Colonel Talbot cleared his throat first. "I was in the library with Mr. Knox. We had a decanter between us, and were lamenting the decline of the Empire. Harold passed us once, said he was going to the Blue Study to work on some document for Lady Eugenia." "Confirmed, Mr. Knox?" Poirot asked gently. Knox nodded. Yes, he was in good spirits, but distracted. Distracted how? He asked a strange question as he passed. Asked if either of us remembered a family named Lavington. I said no. Talbot didn't answer. Talbot squinted. Lavington. That name does sound familiar. Poirot let the name hang in the air like smoke. "Mademoiselle Vale?" he asked, turning. Lenora looked up. "I was in the music room. The storm had given me a headache, so I was playing something soft to distract myself. Alone?" Yes, though I believe Mrs. Ashcroft passed by. The housekeeper gave a tight nod. I did, sir. She was playing Debussy, the soft one, the one with the water. La Cathédrale Engloutie, Poirot offered, a piece that rises from silence. She blinked, a little startled, then nodded. Yes. Poirot paced lightly. And you, Miss Gifford. Penelope uncrossed her legs. I was in my room, reading. Harold had said he might bring me something to look over. He never came. Did you hear anything? I heard the wind, the rain, a door slam once. A window, perhaps? Perhaps, though I assumed it was just the draft. The Old West Wing always complains in weather. Merci. Poirot turned. Mr. Crane? Elliot Crane shrugged. I was in the stables, sir. We'd a colt come down with something. I slept out there. Can't say I heard anything till the maid came crying at dawn. Poirot considered the group. Their stories did not contradict, but neither did they satisfy. Too clean, too prepared, and all of them seemed faintly rehearsed. Even the truth, when spoken carefully, can sound like a lie. He stepped toward the writing desk that had been moved into the room for note-taking. On it, a single item had been placed since the body was removed. A folded handkerchief, found clutched in Harold Fielding's jacket pocket. Monogrammed, O.G. Poirot held it up. This, I believe, does not belong to the deceased. It was found in his jacket, but the initials do not match. Nor was it common for Mr. Fielding to carry such a fine linen square. So I ask, does anyone recognize it? A silence. Then a voice, small and even. It belonged to my uncle. All heads turned. Penelope again. Oswald Gifford. He always carried those. I thought they were all packed away with his belongings after his death. Poirot's eyes sharpened. And yet here was one, unfurled from the jacket pocket of the man who was just about to reveal a secret. The threads of the mystery were beginning to stitch into place. A man clutches at nothing as he dies. Poirot murmured to himself, but sometimes he dies because he once held everything. He turned back to the room. Thank you, mes amis. We shall speak again, individually. He smiled gently. The truth, it has begun to stir. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. Although he had already been present at Grange Hall since the day prior, an invited guest among many, this morning marked the true arrival of Hercule Poirot. Not as a man of leisure, nor a retired gentleman detective enjoying the peculiarities of country life, but as the singular mind now entrusted with unraveling a death that spoke too quietly to be understood by anyone else. The day broke gray and unsteady. The mist had not lifted from the hedgerows, and the manor sat like a stranded ship in a sea of ghost-colored dew. Poirot, dressed with particular care, a pale blue cravat, his best gray suit with a silk waistcoat, and, of course, his shoes polished to perfection. When he entered the drawing-room shortly after 10, the others were already there, seated in expectant silence, as if summoned to a private trial. He made no apology for his promptness, nor for the deliberate pacing of his small, patent leather steps across the Turkish rug. "Messieurs et mesdames," he said softly, "you must forgive me if I do not make idle conversation today. We have, after all, a death in our midst, and though the body has been removed, the mystery remains, and it does not like to be ignored." Lady Eugenia looked up from her armchair, her face drawn but composed. "Have you found something already, Monsieur Poirot?" "I have found many somethings, madame. Small threads. They await the needle." He turned and faced them as a group. 7 guests, each one polite, each one potentially dangerous. Mr. Harold Fielding did not die by accident, nor by illness, nor by simple misfortune. Something, or someone, played a hand in his demise. And while there are no visible wounds, there is a wound all the same. A hush followed. Even the fire seemed to hesitate. Poirot began to walk, slowly, as he spoke. Last night, Mr. Fielding went to the blue study. He had told at least 2 of you that he had uncovered something significant, some hidden truth, connected perhaps to the past of this household. He had asked Miss Vale about a memory, and Miss Gifford about a name. He hinted at a revelation, though he did not reveal it. His gaze landed on Penelope first. "You said he might bring you something to examine?" Penelope nodded. "Yes, a document, I assumed." Yet none was found. No. Poirot turned to the others. He left the library after speaking to Colonel Talbot and Mr. Knox. He was in good spirits, though distracted, and at some point thereafter he died in the blue study, seated, brandy untouched, his hand clutched in death around nothing. Poirot paused beside the desk, now relocated into the drawing-room. He opened a notebook, took a slow breath. "I examined the room carefully this morning. May I share a few details with you?" He looked around. No one objected, not even Colonel Talbot, who usually bristled at insinuations. There were 2 glasses of brandy in the blue study, one barely touched, the other drained. A conversation took place, or was about to take place, but only one glass had a fingerprint, Mr. Fielding's. The other had none. He let the implication linger. Then, also, the fireplace bore a faint trace of an oily substance, almond-scented, a chemical smell. It is too early to confirm, but it may suggest the presence of cyanide, or something like it. Yet Mr. Fielding showed no signs of ingestion. Now eyebrows rose. "No residue in the glass," Poirot continued. "No visible means of poison. Unless, of course, one considers a more subtle instrument, a contact poison, a substance applied to something he touched." Knox interjected now, his voice brittle. "Are you suggesting someone poisoned the brandy glass?" "No, monsieur. I am suggesting the glass he did not drink from may have been bait. Or, perhaps, the document he once held. The one that is now missing." Penelope sat forward, alarm flaring in her usually sardonic eyes. "You mean the object he was holding when he died, the one that's vanished? It could have been laced with poison?" Poirot gave a small, approving nod. "Oui. A man grips nothing at the moment of death unless he gripped something just before it. His hand was frozen in tension, not from pain, but from reflex. Perhaps he picked up a letter, a folded paper. And when he opened it, touched it, it was too late." Lady Eugenia let out a soft breath. Then someone knew he was going to reveal something. Someone feared it. Poirot now walked gently toward her. "Madame, you said Mr. Fielding mentioned your late husband's files. Do you know if any such files are still in the house?" She frowned. After Oswald's death, much was packed away. Some in the attic, some in the West Wing study. But no one has looked at them in years. Poirot's voice was gentle. "Might I be permitted to search them?" "Yes, of course." He made a note, then faced the group again. "I ask one final question for now. A handkerchief was found in Mr. Fielding's pocket, monogrammed with the initials O.G. Talbot grunted. "That's Oswald Gifford. He had dozens of them. Kept them in a drawer lined with lavender soap." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet, one found its way into the pocket of your recently deceased solicitor." No one answered. "Perhaps," Poirot mused, "he found it in the West Wing. Perhaps it was wrapped around something. Or perhaps it was planted." He closed his notebook. I shall now begin individual interviews, but I leave you with a thought. If Harold Fielding was silenced, it was not out of anger, nor greed. It was fear. Someone feared what he had touched. He paused, then smiled faintly. And, mon Dieu, it is always the fear that gives the game away. Chapter 5. The first interviews begin. Poirot conducted his interviews with the precision of a jeweler inspecting flawed diamonds. One by one, the guests were called into the smaller morning room, where a single armchair faced Poirot at an angle too comfortable to feel like an interrogation, but too exposed to allow escape. He arranged a small notebook beside him, untouched. It was the suspect's eyes, their pauses, their phrasing, that interested him more than anything they thought he would record. The first to be summoned was Penelope Gifford. She entered as if walking onto a stage, one hand tucked casually into her coat pocket, the other adjusting a cuff she had already fixed twice that morning. She sat with elegance, crossing one leg over the other with careless defiance. Poirot smiled warmly. "Miss Gifford, thank you for coming." She arched a brow. "I hardly had a choice, did I? But choice always remains, mademoiselle, even when we pretend otherwise." Penelope said nothing. "You were close with Mr. Fielding?" "Close is a word with many meanings, Monsieur Poirot. I leave it to you to choose one." Penelope exhaled softly. "We were intellectually aligned. Harold appreciated truth, and I loathe polite lies. We often discussed things no one else dared to say aloud. Such as the arrangement of my aunt's will, the irregularities in the estate holdings, the legacy of my uncle's business practices. Harold was a man who lived on the edge of discretion. He liked poking at sleeping dogs. And you, I liked watching them wake up." Poirot studied her face, calm, but slightly flushed beneath the cheekbones. "Did he ever mention the name Lavington to you?" Penelope's eyes narrowed, if only for a second. "No." "You're certain?" "Yes." He nodded once. "Thank you, mademoiselle." She rose, but paused at the door. "Harold wasn't afraid of many things, but the last time we spoke, he looked over his shoulder twice. That's when I knew something had changed." Poirot made a mental note. The guilty conceal, the innocent forget, the clever do both. Next came Colonel Rupert Talbot. He strode in, stiffer than usual, and took the seat as if it were a military tribunal. "Let's get on with it," he said. "You were in the library last night with Mr. Knox, I believe." "Yes. Scotch. Talk of the war, same as always." "Did Mr. Fielding say anything to you?" "He asked about Lavington. Said he thought Oswald had dealings with them. I told him I didn't recall. That was true. Might have been some minor contract." Poirot observed the fidgeting of the colonel's boot. "You served with Oswald in Egypt, yes?" Talbot nodded. "Knew him better than I know my own brother. Was he the sort of man to hide dangerous secrets?" The colonel's eyes flicked to the side. "Everyone in business hides something, Poirot. That's not the same as being dangerous. Do you remember his handkerchiefs? Lavender scented, embroidered, obsessed over them like they were relics. Would you find it odd if one turned up in Fielding's pocket? I'd find it impossible." "And yet," Talbot frowned, "then something was staged. Harold wouldn't carry Oswald's handkerchief, not unless it meant something." Poirot tapped his fingers together. "Or unless he found it wrapped around something meant to be destroyed." Talbot stood. "This isn't a war, Poirot." Poirot gave a faint smile. "No, Colonel, but someone here treats it like one." The third to enter was Lenora Vale. She moved like a shadow, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes distant. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. "You were playing music last night," Poirot said gently. "Yes, the rain made it impossible to sleep." "You were fond of Mr. Fielding?" She gave a fragile nod. "He listened to me, not just to my music, but to me." "Did he tell you he was afraid?" She hesitated. "Yes, 2 nights ago. He said someone had lied to him for a very long time, and he had proof now, that's all." "Did he show you anything?" "No." "Did he mention the name Lavington?" She shook her head. "Miss Vale," Poirot said, leaning slightly forward, "what do you think Harold was going to reveal?" Tears welled, but did not fall. "Something about the past. Something ugly. This house has too many locked doors." "He was unlocking one. And you? Did you want it unlocked?" She looked up, then away. "Yes, even if it hurt." Poirot let her go. He did not summon Mr. Knox immediately. Instead, he asked for Mrs. Ashcroft, the housekeeper. She stood in the doorway before entering, then sat stiffly. "You've been in this house longer than anyone," Poirot began. "I keep it running. That's all. You saw Mr. Fielding often. When he came to consult with Lady Eugenia, he was respectful. Distant. Did you see him last night?" "I walked past the music room. Saw Miss Vale. Harold passed me in the corridor soon after. Looked pale, muttering something about keys." "Keys? I think he was looking for the West Wing cabinet." Poirot's eyes gleamed faintly. "And that cabinet, what does it contain?" "Old papers, files from the steelworks. Lord Gifford kept everything, even when it was outdated. No one's touched it in years." "Did Mr. Fielding find it?" "If he did, he didn't return the key." Poirot rose. "Merci, madame." The interviews continued. Knox, precise and nervous, denied everything except the Scotch. Crane, the groundskeeper, had nothing to add. His eyes betrayed little, but Poirot noted a strange crease in the man's sleeve, as though something small had been carried and quickly hidden. By noon, Poirot closed his notebook. The lies had begun to tighten around the truth. In a house like Grange Hall, secrets did not remain buried. They lingered in attics, in ledgers, in lavender-scented cloth, and the hand of a man who died gripping nothing, and yet held everything. Tomorrow he would examine the West Wing cabinet. And there, Poirot believed, the first true crack in the facade would appear. Chapter 6. The First False Lead. The West Wing of Grange Hall was a seldom-used corridor of silence. Its walls were lined with heavy portraits of forgotten ancestors, men with unkind mouths and women with pale, unsmiling eyes, each watching Poirot with a dignity that bordered on disdain. The carpet here was faded, its pattern long rubbed thin beneath the feet of memory. Poirot moved slowly, brushing his gloved hand across the dark-paneled wainscoting as he followed Mrs. Ashcroft's directions. At the far end of the hall stood the cabinet in question, an imposing walnut structure with brass handles and a lock long tarnished by neglect. It smelled faintly of damp paper and old ink. As Poirot turned the key, retrieved reluctantly from the butler that morning, a soft click echoed, the kind that belonged in cathedrals or tombs. Inside, a chaos of ledgers, folded correspondence, ledger books, and bundled receipts spilled forth like the abandoned entrails of a life once too carefully documented. Poirot took his time. This was not the work of an hour, nor of idle fingers. This was archaeology. He sifted through layers of transactions, company minutes from 2 decades ago. Shipping manifests, coded initials. Many papers bore Oswald Gifford's signature, always exacting, always final. Then, after nearly 45 minutes, Poirot's fingers stilled on a slim folio marked in pencil. Lavington Contract, 1918. He withdrew it carefully. The pages inside were typed, brittle but intact. The ink had faded, but the names leapt out like curses. Agreement between Gifford Steelworks and Lavington Holdings. Subcontracted labor provision. March 1918. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Lavington Holdings had long ago vanished into financial mist, but in 1918 it was active, very active. The document detailed not just raw material shipments, but wages, oddly low wages, shockingly low. Names were listed. Workers brought in under short-term conditions from overseas. Poirot examined the fine print. Temporary housing provided. Medical care assumed by subcontractor. Compensation for accidents voided under Clause 6B. A shadow passed over his expression. This was not merely business. This was exploitation, legalized suffering, signed and sealed. A small notation had been added in Fielding's handwriting at the bottom, scribbled hastily. Cross-reference with Eugenia's personal ledger, 1920. Poirot returned to the main house, the folio under his arm. He found Lady Eugenia in the conservatory, sipping tea under a lattice of climbing roses, her composure as ironclad as ever. "Madame," he said, seating himself opposite her, "may I ask, did you know of your husband's agreement with Lavington Holdings?" She blinked once. "Not in detail. Oswald handled the industrial side. I concerned myself only with charitable endeavors and property. Yet this contract bears the stain of cruelty. Laborers with no protection, accidents unaccounted for. It paints a grim picture." Her fingers tightened on her teacup. "You imply I condoned it?" "I imply nothing, madame. But Mr. Fielding discovered this file, and he feared what it meant." Lady Eugenia's silence was as telling as any confession. "Harold told me," she said at last, voice low, "that he believed this agreement, if revealed, would ruin what's left of the Gifford name. That it might even place criminal pressure on the trustees. That's why he was hesitant to bring it to light. He wanted to verify whether the Lavington firm still existed, whether its victims had descendants." Poirot stood. "Merci, madame. You have helped more than you know." With the document in hand, Poirot returned to the drawing-room, where the guests had gathered once more. Word had spread of his investigations. Whispers had risen like smoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have found the document Mr. Fielding uncovered, a contract, a shameful one, and yet revealing." He laid the folio on the table. The Lavington agreement, signed by Oswald Gifford. It detailed unethical labor practices during the height of the war. "Mr. Fielding found this yesterday evening. I believe he intended to confront someone with it." There was a sharp intake of breath. Jasper Knox leaned forward. "That's it? That's what this has been about?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Non, monsieur, that is only part of it." Knox sneered. "Then forgive me if I don't clutch my pearls. Businessmen did unsavory things during the war. Everyone knows that. But not everyone silences a man for it." Colonel Talbot stood. "You think one of us killed Harold over that?" Poirot folded his hands. "It is a plausible motive, a stain to be buried, a legacy to protect." Penelope's voice cut in, laced with venom. "Then arrest my aunt. It's her name on the damn plaque." Lady Eugenia stood too. "Be silent, Penelope." Lenora Vale looked to Poirot. "But is that the answer, then? Harold found the contract and someone panicked?" Poirot walked slowly to the fireplace. "No, mademoiselle, it is not the answer. Because, alas for the murderer, The folio was still in the cabinet, untouched, unpoisoned. He turned back. The paper Mr. Fielding held at the moment of death was something else entirely. The room fell still. "You see," he continued, "I now believe someone knew about the Lavington contract before Harold did. Knew it would lead to questions. And so they crafted a clever deception. They assumed I would find this file, that it would explain the death." Penelope stared. "Are you saying it's a decoy?" Poirot nodded. "A false lead, mademoiselle, crafted not with the intent of concealing a crime, but of explaining it away too conveniently." He leaned in, voice quiet. "And when the solution comes too easily, that is when I become suspicious. Someone had placed the Lavington file there for him to find. Someone who had hoped the past would answer for the present. But Poirot's little gray cells whispered another truth. The real reason for Harold Fielding's death had not yet been found, but the false one had just unraveled. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The storm had returned that evening, not with thunder, but with an oppressive hush, the air pregnant with unshed rain. Outside the leaded windows of Grange Hall, the garden bowed under the weight of stillness. The roses slumped like mourners at a forgotten grave. Inside, Poirot moved through the house with surgical calm, the echo of his polished steps acting like a metronome to tension that could no longer be ignored. Harold Fielding's death had cast a pall over the estate, but it was the unraveling of the false lead that had truly shifted the balance. The suspects were no longer passive observers. Now they watched each other. Now they measured their words. Now, Poirot knew, they would begin to crack, not from brute questioning, but from the unbearable strain of secrets brushing too near the surface. It was time to play the game. He began with Jasper Knox. Poirot found him in the billiards room, pretending to examine a cue, though the table had not been used since the day of the murder. Knox's shirt sleeves were rolled too high, his collar too neat. Poirot's entrance startled him, despite the detective making no attempt to conceal it. "Monsieur Knox," Poirot said mildly, "a moment, if you please." Knox turned, attempting a smile. "Of course. Something new?" Poirot gestured to the empty table. "A curious place to reflect on death." "I find quiet helps," Knox muttered, "and the drawing-room is full of vultures." "Oui. And yet it is only the guilty who see beaks where there are merely eyes." Knox stiffened. "I'm not sure I follow." "Of course not," Poirot said smoothly. "But perhaps you can help me with something. The Lavington contract. Were you aware of it before I discovered it this morning?" Knox shook his head. "No. Harold kept his files tightly controlled. He never trusted me." "No," Poirot said, pacing. "And yet, you were both involved in the restructuring of the Gifford Trust after Oswald's death, were you not?" "I handled the investments. He did the estate. Then perhaps you merely overlooked the contract." Knox hesitated. "Perhaps, though I would never have let something like that go unnoticed. It's damning." "Indeed," Poirot said. "Damning enough to kill for?" The question hit the air like a slap. Knox recoiled slightly, then recovered. "I see what you're doing. Do you? You think I'm lying. Only you would know." Knox exhaled. "Look, I'm not proud of everything I've done, but murder? I wouldn't risk everything I've built for a document from 20 years ago. Besides, it's Eugenia's name on the deal, not mine." Poirot smiled. "Ah, but she is untouchable. You, monsieur, you are merely replaceable." Knox looked away. Poirot left without another word. He next approached Lenora Vale. who sat alone on the back terrace, her fingers running over the keys of an imaginary piano on the stone balustrade. She did not flinch when Poirot joined her. "You look tired, mademoiselle?" She nodded. "I didn't sleep." "Was it guilt that kept you awake?" She turned her face slightly. "No." "Then was it fear?" A long silence. "Then, yes." Poirot's voice softened. "Of whom?" "I don't know," she whispered. "That's the worst part. I don't know who among us could do this, but you suspect someone. I see things, feel things, the way people speak when they think no one is listening." "Such as?" "I heard Penelope on the phone last week. She thought she was alone in the garden. She was arguing with someone about Harold. She said, 'If he opens that cabinet, I'm finished.' I thought it was melodrama. Now I'm not so sure." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Merci, mademoiselle." Before rising, he gently added, "And did Harold ever play games with you?" She frowned. "Games?" "Psychological ones. Truths hidden beneath questions, unsaid things." Lenora looked away. He did with everyone. He liked seeing what people revealed when he only hinted. He was always reaching for something that made him feel powerful. "Even the truth?" She said nothing. Poirot left her in the fog. He summoned Penelope Gifford to the morning room an hour later. She entered as she always did, balanced, deliberate, coldly beautiful. But Poirot detected a new tension in her shoulders, a tautness to her voice that hadn't been there before. "I hear," he began, "that you made a telephone call from the garden last week, concerning Mr. Fielding." Penelope did not blink. "I make many calls. My professional life doesn't pause just because I'm locked in a manor with murder." "Indeed," Poirot said. "But you said something very specific, that if Harold opened the cabinet, you'd be finished." She stared. Then, slowly, "I was being metaphorical." "Ah, but metaphor, mademoiselle, does not clutch at nothing as it dies." She shifted slightly, her hands curling in her lap. "I knew about the Lavington file," she said finally. "Not its details. Just that Harold said it was dangerous, that it might complicate the trust. I was worried it would tie up my inheritance in legal disputes." "So you threatened him?" "No, but I warned him not to act too quickly. I told him to speak to me first." Poirot leaned in. "And did he?" She hesitated. "No, he died before he could." "Then perhaps," Poirot said quietly, "someone made sure he never would." She didn't answer. As evening fell, Poirot sat alone in the library, notes scattered around him like fallen cards. The suspects had spoken, each betraying more than they intended. Lies had rippled beneath the surface, half-truths tangled with wounded pride. But one thing remained clear. Someone had staged a misdirection, and now, under Poirot's gaze, they were beginning to sweat. The game had begun, and the mind most likely to break, it would not be the weakest. It would be the proudest. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. By morning, the mood in Grange Hall had curdled. The staff moved more quietly. The guests lingered in rooms they didn't belong in, pretending to read, to play chess, to polish shoes. But Poirot had seen such choreography before. It was the elaborate pantomime of the guilty, or, at the very least, the fearful. Something had shifted since yesterday. A delicate strand snapped somewhere in the house. He could feel it in the silence between conversations, in the nervous glances toward the blue study, in the way Penelope's voice had grown clipped and Knox had become uncharacteristically invisible. The storm clouds had passed, but Poirot knew another kind of weather had arrived. It began with a missing page. At precisely 9:30, Mrs. Ashcroft knocked firmly on Poirot's study door. She held a linen-bound ledger, one of Lady Eugenia's personal books from her philanthropic accounts, retrieved under Poirot's request for comparison with Fielding's handwritten note. "I thought you should see this, monsieur," the housekeeper said tightly. "I fetched it from the safe this morning. It's been tampered with." Poirot gestured for her to enter. She placed the book gently on his desk and flipped to the bookmarked page. A clean, deliberate tear marred the middle of the ledger. A single sheet was missing, page 198, neatly removed along the stitched binding. The page numbers jumped directly from 197 to 199. Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Was this intact yesterday?" "I opened it when you asked for all estate materials relating to 1920, Mrs. Ashcroft said. "It was whole then. I remember because the figure on that page had been circled in Harold Fielding's hand." Poirot leaned closer. The figures were meticulously kept. Lady Eugenia's estate finances itemized with alarming clarity. The adjacent pages showed donations to several post-war charities, including one to a defunct hospital in Leicestershire. "And no one has access to this safe except you?" Poirot asked. "Only myself and Lady Eugenia." He nodded, fingers steepled. "So someone entered the study last night, quietly, removed this single page. And," Mrs. Ashcroft added, "reset the lock." "Très intéressant." Poirot stood. "Would you kindly ask Lady Eugenia to join me here?" The housekeeper nodded and left. As Poirot waited, he paced slowly. A stolen page. A contract from the past. A solicitor silenced mid-revelation. The puzzle pieces were growing more specific and more dangerous. The question was no longer who had motive, but who had foresight. Someone had staged a false lead, and now someone had realized Poirot was getting too close to the real one. Lady Eugenia entered the room moments later, calm as always, her face unreadable. "Madame," Poirot said with a bow, "I regret troubling you again, but I must ask, were you aware that one of your ledgers has been altered?" "I was not. This particular volume was kept in your private safe, and now one page, only one, is missing. A page your solicitor had reportedly marked just days ago." She tilted her chin slightly. "You think this has something to do with Harold's death?" "I think, madame," Poirot replied gently, "that someone in this house is attempting to erase what he found." Lady Eugenia did not reply for a moment. Then, "Would you like me to have the locks changed?" "No," Poirot said. "Leave everything as it is. A thief grows bolder when they believe themselves unseen." As the lady departed, Poirot allowed himself a moment of reflection. The ledger was not an accident. This, at last, was the second mystery. One murder, Poirot thought, is like a flame in a dark room. But a second crime, no matter how small, illuminates the shadows in ways the first never could. A murder may be bold, but its aftermath always reveals the murderer's truest fear. Discovery. He returned to the drawing room, where most of the guests were now gathered, pretending to be anywhere else. Without preamble, Poirot spoke. "There has been a theft," he said, his voice measured. "Last night, someone entered Lady Eugenia's private study and removed a single page from her personal ledger. A page that Mr. Fielding had recently annotated. That page is now missing." Silence. "Curious, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot continued. "Just as I begin to understand the true stakes of Mr. Fielding's discovery, someone attempts to erase the very clue that would have helped me. How unfortunate for them." Jasper Knox coughed. "It could have been a staff member. Those ledgers are worth a fortune to the press." Poirot turned to him. no staff member knew which volume I had requested, nor which page had been marked. Only those present yesterday in this very room knew the significance. "Then you're accusing one of us?" Penelope asked. Poirot smiled thinly. "I accuse no one. I observe everyone." Lenora Vale, seated quietly by the hearth, whispered, "You think the person who removed that page also killed Harold?" "I think," Poirot replied, "they are one and the same, or very close to each other." He saw it then. A twitch in Penelope's jaw. A flicker in Knox's gaze. Talbot's hand tightened around his cane. Lady Eugenia sat utterly still. Only Lenora looked pale with honesty. Poirot folded his hands. "Soon, mes amis, I shall ask for the return of what was stolen, privately, but should the guilty party decline, I shall retrieve it myself." He turned on his heel and left them in silence. As he climbed the stairs to his room, he reflected on what he now knew. The Lavington file had been planted, too visible, too convenient. But the stolen ledger page? That was real, urgent, reactionary. It was not part of a plan. It was an act of fear. And Hercule Poirot, guided by the psychology of guilt, now had a fresh scent to follow. The murderer had blinked, and in doing so, revealed more than they ever intended. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the long shadows of Grange Hall stretched across its polished floors, Poirot returned to the West Wing, not to search for evidence, but to think. The hallway, with its faded portraits and undisturbed silence, offered the stillness he needed to gather his thoughts. The events of the past days had created a tangle of motives and maneuvers, but now he began to see the threads connecting them. It was never one secret, he reminded himself. It was always many. The murder of Harold Fielding was the sharp point of the blade, but it had been forged from decades of buried truths. And now one of those truths was fighting to stay hidden. Back in the morning room, Poirot called for the housekeeper once more. Mrs. Ashcroft arrived briskly, ever the guardian of routine, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of wariness. She no longer looked at Poirot with polite detachment. Now there was a hint of fear, too, perhaps not of guilt, but of what he might uncover. "Madame," he began gently, "I require your help in understanding something about the Gifford family history. Something discreet." She paused, hands folded before her. "If I can assist, I will." Poirot tapped the ledger's cover. "The missing page. You say Harold had marked it?" "Yes. And what was on it?" She hesitated. "A financial entry, a large one, unusual, a transfer made to an individual, not a charity. The name was Miss L. Ashcroft." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You?" Mrs. Ashcroft nodded stiffly. "I was surprised, too, monsieur. I had never seen it before. It was dated nearly 20 years ago, before Mr. Gifford passed. And yet your surname was listed clearly. I can't explain it." Poirot tilted his head. "But I believe you can. You knew Oswald Gifford long before he married Lady Eugenia, did you not?" She said nothing. Her silence was the answer. "He gave you the money discreetly. Why?" Her lips pressed tightly, but her voice emerged at last. "Because I asked him to. Not for myself, but for someone else." "Who?" "My daughter." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "I was unaware you had a daughter." "I don't," she said quickly. "Not now." Poirot let that settle. A silence unfolded between them, dense, respectful. "She was the result of a mistake," the housekeeper said at last. "Born when I was 16, raised by another family under an assumed name. Mr. Gifford was not her father, but He was the reason I couldn't raise her myself. He had made promises to my family. My father worked in the mill. There was an incident, a cover-up. The girl's care was compensation. And Harold Fielding found proof of this. I believe he was getting close. I think the missing ledger page had her real name on it, or her adoptive one. Poirot stood slowly. You must tell me, madame, what was the name of your daughter? She answered with barely a breath, Lenora Vale. Poirot's heart beat once, very deliberately. The pianist, the quiet one, the one who had shown real grief when Harold died. He bowed his head. Merci. Alone once more. Poirot turned over what this meant. Harold Fielding had discovered a connection between Lenora and the Gifford estate, one never legally recognized. A payment made in silence, hidden behind charitable entries. Lenora herself may not have known, but someone else had, and they had taken a page to erase the past. It was no longer just about legacy. It was about identity, inheritance, bloodlines. He returned to the drawing room where the guests had congregated after supper. With measured calm, Poirot addressed them. I must ask you all to remain in the house tonight. No one is to leave, not even to walk the grounds. We are on the brink, mes amis. A truth once buried is now gasping for air. Colonel Talbot, bristling, rose from his seat. Surely you've found enough by now to accuse someone. I have found too much, Poirot replied, and yet not quite enough. Penelope scoffed. So what now? We sit and wait while you pace in circles. No, mademoiselle, Poirot said. Now, we go back. They all stared. I require access, he continued, to Lady Eugenia's late husband's journals, the private ones. I am told they were kept in a locked chest in the attic. Lady Eugenia stiffened. Those were never meant for anyone's eyes. But someone has already read them, Poirot said softly, and killed to protect what they found. The room froze. It was the first time Poirot had said it plainly. He turned to Lenora, who sat on the edge of the chaise longue, a porcelain cup trembling faintly in her hand. Mademoiselle, he said gently, do you know who you are? She looked up, startled. What do you mean? Poirot took a breath. You are not simply an artist in residence, nor merely a friend of Penelope. You are something else, someone else. And the key to this mystery lies in a truth that was stolen from you. Lenora's mouth parted, but she said nothing. Poirot folded his arms. Someone here knows. And that person is running out of time. The evening passed in brittle silence. No one left their room. No doors creaked open after midnight. But Poirot slept very little. He dreamed of a hand clutching nothing, of a ledger with a torn page, of a girl raised among strangers, of a murderer staring down a legacy that could not be silenced. The next day, he would break it all open. But tonight, the house held its breath. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. Dawn at Grange Hall broke through the mist with a reluctant light, painting the stone walls in shades of gray and pearl. The garden glistened with dew, but no one walked it. The house had become a sealed chamber, each inhabitant moving cautiously, aware now that the walls had ears, and that Hercule Poirot was very close to unveiling something irreversible. But Poirot, despite appearances, was not yet ready to reveal. He was still listening, still watching, still waiting. He rose early and requested only black coffee, which he drank in solitude beside the library window. Then, slipping away before the others stirred, he returned to the attic. Lady Eugenia's warning had not dissuaded him. The chest at the end of the attic, tucked beneath a moth-eaten tapestry, was precisely where Mrs. Ashcroft had said it would be. heavy, untouched for years. He opened it with slow hands. The scent of cedar and thyme escaped as he lifted the lid. Inside were bound volumes of journals, Oswald Gifford's handwriting filling every page in the sharp, clinical style of a man who left no thought unrecorded. Poirot flipped carefully through the entries, scanning for any mention of Lavington, Ashcroft, or Fielding. Most passages chronicled industrial dealings, wartime frustrations, and complaints about Parliament. But one journal, dated autumn 1920, was different. Several pages had been excised. Cleanly, deliberately, but not all. Near the end, a half-finished entry remained. The matter with M.A. is concluded. I have made the payment. It should secure silence. No official claim can arise. But the girl, L., if she ever returns, there will be questions. Eugenia must never know. Poirot paused. M.A. Margaret Ashcroft. The girl, L. Lenora. And Eugenia must never know. But someone else had known. Someone had come here before him, had read this, had removed what could not be allowed to survive. And yet, they had overlooked one vital clue, a thing so small, so simple, that Poirot nearly missed it. As he closed the journal, something thin slid from between the back cover and the final page. A photograph, faded, curled at the corners, a young girl, 6 or 7 years old, smiling in a garden not unlike the one at Grange Hall. She held a doll in one hand. The other hand was held by a tall man, his face out of frame. On the back, in a firm hand, L. Summer 1927, just before she left. Poirot stared at it for a long time. He returned to the morning room before the house had fully awakened. There, seated beside the fire, he waited. One by one, the guests filtered in. Lady Eugenia first, then Penelope, Knox, Talbot, and finally Lenora. Pale and silent. They gathered around him like students before a final lesson. He did not speak of the photo. Not yet. Instead, he turned his eyes toward Penelope Gifford. "Last night," he began, "a page was removed from a ledger in your aunt's study. That page detailed a payment, 20 years ago, from Oswald Gifford to Margaret Ashcroft. That payment, as it turns out, was not for charity. It was for silence, for the raising of a child outside this house." Penelope's eyes narrowed, but she did not speak. "This morning," Poirot continued, "I found a journal entry confirming that the child, Lenora Vale, was Oswald's ward, perhaps even his daughter. The journal suggests Lady Eugenia was never informed." Now it was Lady Eugenia who stiffened. "What are you saying?" Poirot inclined his head. "That Miss Vale has a stronger claim to the Gifford estate than anyone here." A silence fell. He let it grow heavy. "She has no legal documents," Knox interjected too quickly. "Perhaps not," Poirot said. But Harold Fielding had begun preparing a petition. He had begun the process of validating Lenora's claim. And someone, mes amis, someone found out. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Lenora's voice was barely audible. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Poirot looked at her with quiet compassion. "I believe you." Then he turned back to the others. "But someone did. Someone read the journals before I did. Someone removed pages, first from the ledger, then from the journal itself. Someone who feared the collapse of their future. Should Lenora's connection be proven?" He stood and walked to the fire. The photograph still rested in his pocket. But Poirot was not yet ready to show his final card. Instead, he placed his hand gently on the mantelpiece. His fingers rested near the small silver clock that had once sat askew, adjusted, Poirot recalled, by precisely 5 minutes. Before he died, Poirot said, Harold Fielding entered the blue study, He found something. Perhaps this photo. Perhaps a document. Whatever it was, he held it in his hand, and then died. Colonel Talbot grunted. "You're still claiming poison, then?" "I am claiming contact poison, Colonel. Something laced onto an object he would inevitably touch. Paper, yes, but perhaps the back of a photograph, or a letter folded and waiting." Lady Eugenia frowned. "That seems extravagant." "No," Poirot said. "It is precise, elegant, quiet. The mark of someone who understands fear, who understood exactly how close Harold had come." His gaze slid to Penelope again. She met it, unblinking, and Poirot knew. She had placed the photograph in the study, perhaps wrapped around a letter, perhaps slipped into an envelope left carefully on the desk, and afterward she had removed it, burned it. But she had not known another copy still remained, tucked inside a journal no one was supposed to open. He said none of this aloud. Not yet. Instead, Poirot turned back to the room, his voice cool and final. "The truth is very nearly complete," he said. "But before I gather you all for the final reckoning, I will allow the guilty party one last opportunity." His eyes swept the room. "Return what was taken. Restore what you attempted to erase. And perhaps you will be spared the sharpest edge of justice." No one spoke. No one moved. Poirot nodded once, then turned and left the room. In his pocket the photograph remained, and with it the final piece of the puzzle. He would wait, but not for long. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The walls of Grange Hall seemed to tighten that afternoon, as though the house itself sensed the pressure mounting within its walls. Shadows gathered in the corners of every room, not long and dramatic, but subtle, lingering reminders that secrets, like rot, spread in silence. Poirot, ever composed, spent the early hours in solitude, walking the perimeter of the house and occasionally pausing to gaze at the horizon. But within him, the engine of the mind was working tirelessly. He was no longer asking whether Penelope had planted the object that killed Harold Fielding. He was asking who had helped her, who had known, or turned away, or silently benefited. Because murder, he well knew, is rarely a solitary act. Even if committed by one hand, it is often supported by the willful blindness of others. Inside, the household had begun to fray. Colonel Talbot and Jasper Knox argued in the study over the wine inventory, a thin excuse for a deeper tension neither man dared name. Knox accused Talbot of interfering in the family's affairs. Talbot accused Knox of keeping Lady Eugenia vulnerable. Poirot, listening from the hallway, heard the old soldier's voice crack ever so slightly when he said, "I knew Oswald." He would never have let it come to this. Meanwhile, Penelope had vanished. Mrs. Ashcroft reported she had taken her tea alone in the solarium and had refused luncheon. "She looked pale, monsieur," the housekeeper said, "like someone waiting for a verdict." Poirot thanked her and made his way to the solarium himself, but Penelope had already gone. Only the imprint of her presence remained, a cigarette in a dish, half burned, a novel left face down beside a steaming cup of untouched tea. He returned to the drawing-room, where Lenora sat quietly near the hearth, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He approached gently. "Mademoiselle Vale, you are not well?" "I haven't been since Harold died," she said quietly. Poirot sat across from her. "Did he ever hint that your parentage might be different than you believed?" She shook her head. "Not directly, but he asked odd questions about my childhood, about my schooling. He once asked if I remembered a house with roses. I thought he meant my foster home. I didn't realize." Her voice broke. Poirot leaned forward. "Do you believe it now?" She nodded. "I saw the photograph. I don't remember the moment, but I know it's me. I know it. And if you are Oswald Gifford's child," Poirot said, "then you are heir to a fortune that was denied to you. Others, present company included, stand to lose everything." "I don't want money," she said fiercely. "I only want the truth." Poirot smiled softly. "Then you are the only one in this house who does." Outside, thunder grumbled in the distance. Not a storm, but a reckoning. Poirot gathered the guests again that evening, though the setting felt less like a meeting and more like a séance. The tension had soured into open distrust. Penelope sat apart from the others, her arms folded and her eyes fixed on the fire. Colonel Talbot leaned on his cane like it was a sword, and Jasper Knox hovered near the brandy decanter, avoiding eye contact. Lady Eugenia wore her grief like armor. Lenora remained near Poirot, silent but alert. "My friends," Poirot began, "the truth has almost finished dressing herself. Only a final button remains." He looked at each of them, his gaze cool. "You may believe I have already made up my mind, that I know who killed Mr. Fielding, and in a sense, yes, I do. But I must know more. I must understand not just who committed the act, but who allowed it, who watched it unfold, who helped, however quietly, to construct a murder." Knox laughed under his breath. "That's a rather dramatic way to say we all might be guilty." "Exactement," Poirot said. "And some of you are." A long silence. Poirot turned toward Lady Eugenia. "Madame, the journals of your late husband were kept from you. Your family's past has been carved to exclude an inconvenient truth. Were you aware of any of it?" She raised her chin. "I was not. But I should have been. I allowed myself the luxury of ignorance." Poirot nodded. "And you, Colonel Talbot? You knew Oswald longer than anyone here. Did you suspect he had an illegitimate child?" "I had suspicions," Talbot admitted. "But Oswald was a closed book. If there was shame to be buried, he buried it deep. Did you ever speak to Harold about it?" "No," Talbot said after a pause. "But I saw him reading those journals. I warned him not to dig too deep." Poirot raised an eyebrow. Was that a warning or a threat? Talbot stood angry. A warning. He didn't listen. "And you, Mr. Knox?" Poirot said, pivoting without pause. "You manage the family finances. You must have seen the same ledger entries Harold did. Did you not think to ask why a housekeeper was paid a large sum 2 decades ago?" "I assumed it was hush money," Knox said flatly. "But I didn't care. My job is to keep the numbers tidy, not question their origins. But now," Poirot said slowly, "those numbers have become a motive." Penelope spoke at last. "This is ridiculous. Everyone here is flailing in the dark, waiting for you to make some dramatic speech. If you know who did it, say it." "I shall," Poirot said. "Tomorrow, when we are all gathered in the blue study." He turned toward the hallway, then looked back. "But before then, I will leave you all with one thought. There is a photograph in my possession, one that proves everything Harold feared, one that someone in this room thought they destroyed." Every eye widened. "And that," Poirot said quietly, "is why you are all afraid." He left them in silence, and behind him, like the turning of a clock's final gear, came the sound of a single breath drawn too sharply. It was beginning to break. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The blue study had not been entered since the night of Harold Fielding's death. Its door remained closed, its windows latched, and the room still carried the faintest hint of almonds beneath its bookish musk. That morning, Poirot had the fire relit and the curtains drawn wide, letting the gray light of the Somerset morning flood in. He arranged 7 chairs in a semicircle facing the hearth and took the 8th for himself, slightly apart, so he might observe them all. A single envelope, unmarked and sealed, sat on the side table beside him. At 11 sharp, the guests arrived, quiet, brittle, barely looking at one another. Lady Eugenia entered first, flanked by Colonel Talbot, both moving slowly but with purpose. Jasper Knox followed, hands in his pockets, eyes darting. Lenora, pale but steady, nodded to Poirot as she passed. Mrs. Ashcroft came next, face unreadable, and finally Penelope, wearing a new blouse of ivory silk, her posture immaculate, her jaw locked. Poirot stood only when they had all taken their seats. "Mes amis," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "we have reached the moment where shadows will be banished." He placed his fingertips together. This room, you recall, was the scene of a silent crime. No struggle, no scream. Only a man seated by the fire, dead, with his hand clenched as if grasping some final truth. That image has haunted me, but also guided me. He paused. I believe that truth was a photograph left deliberately where Mr. Fielding would find it. It was laced with a contact poison, absorbed through the fingertips. Silent, swift, effective, and I believe the person who placed it there did so knowing precisely what it would do. No one spoke. No one moved. Poirot continued. Why a photograph, you ask? Because it was the simplest vessel for a truth too dangerous to say aloud, and because it could be destroyed. And yet, as fate would have it, another copy survived. He reached into his pocket, withdrew the faded photograph, and held it aloft. The image of a girl, smiling, holding the hand of the man whose journals were buried in the attic above us. He turned to Lenora. "You, mademoiselle." Her breath caught, but she nodded. I believe it now. Poirot lowered the photograph. Harold Fielding had begun preparations to bring this truth to light. He was drafting legal steps to recognize Lenora as the rightful heir to part of Oswald Gifford's estate. He intended to confront Lady Eugenia, or perhaps Penelope, once he confirmed his suspicions. That night, someone ensured he would never get the chance. He looked slowly at each of them. Only one of you had the opportunity to place the poisoned item in the study before Harold arrived. Only one of you had access to the journals, the ledger, the safe, and only one of you stood to lose everything. His gaze fell squarely on Penelope. "You, mademoiselle." Penelope blinked, her jaw tightening. "That is absurd." Poirot's voice remained calm. "You have always been sharp, resourceful, dangerous when cornered. You knew of Lenora's connection long before Harold confirmed it. You knew because you found the photograph in your late uncle's journals. You read the same entries I found, only you read them first and removed the most damning pages. But you kept the photo. Why?" Penelope's voice was brittle. "I didn't. Because you thought you could use it. Not just as evidence, but as a trap. And when Harold began asking questions about Margaret Ashcroft, about ledgers, about the Lavington contract, you realized he was close to putting everything together." Poirot gestured to the envelope on the table. "In this envelope is the torn edge of the journal page you removed. It was tucked behind the chest lining, missed during your hurried extraction. It matches the missing journal. The handwriting is yours, not Oswald's, not Harold's, yours." Penelope stood now, her face pale. "That proves nothing. I was trying to protect my family." "No," Poirot said. You were protecting yourself. If Lenora was acknowledged, your share of the estate would diminish. If the truth about Oswald's arrangements became public, your reputation would suffer. So you staged the discovery of the Lavington contract, hoping I would chase that red herring. And when that failed, you panicked. He stepped closer. You lured Harold to the blue study. You left the photograph, perhaps wrapped in a letter, perhaps lying in plain view, knowing he would pick it up. And when he did, the poison did its work. Penelope's voice rose, thin and sharp. You have no proof I touched that photograph. I have the residue, Poirot said, lifted from the photograph's back, a rare form of aconitine oil, and the kitchen log shows you asked for gloves the day before, claiming to polish silver, gloves you never returned. Silence. Then a small voice, Lenora's. Why didn't you tell me? Penelope turned to her, trembling now, because I knew once you learned who you were, you'd come for what was yours. And I've lived in this house too long to be cast aside like a ghost. Lenora stood slowly. I never wanted your inheritance. Then what do you want? Penelope snapped. Poirot answered for her. She wants what Harold died trying to give her, the truth. Penelope's breath hitched, and in that stillness, Poirot moved to the door. The police are on their way. You will have time to speak before they arrive. I suggest you use it wisely. He paused once more. Hand on the doorknob. Murder is never a clean wound, mademoiselle. It bleeds into every corner of the soul, but confession, at least, can cleanse a portion of it. He opened the door and left. Behind him, silence, and then, softly, the sound of a woman beginning to cry. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The confession did not come easily. After Poirot's departure from the blue study, the guests remained seated in stunned silence. Penelope Gifford had sunk back into her chair, one hand trembling against her forehead, the other curled tightly around the armrest as if clinging to dignity. No one dared speak. Even the fire, once lively, seemed to have quieted, its crackling replaced by the heavy throb of silence. But Poirot knew better than to expect immediate collapse. Guilt could be theatrical, but it was rarely punctual. It writhed, twisted, resisted. It found dark corners to retreat to, where excuses and justifications bloomed like mold, and so he waited. He took his place once more in the library, seated beneath the oil portrait of Oswald Gifford. The photograph of Lenora lay beside him, the poisoned copy locked safely in the drawer. The envelope with Penelope's handwriting remained untouched, and Poirot, motionless save for the occasional flick of his eyes toward the window, allowed the clock to tick. By noon, she had not come. By half-past, Poirot rose. He knew her well enough by now to suspect she would not surrender. Not out of shame. Penelope Gifford had long since learned to live without the burdens of remorse, but out of fear, a different instinct entirely. And fear, as Poirot had said, makes people act. He stepped into the hallway and found Mrs. Ashcroft pacing near the stairwell. "Ah," Poirot said, "just the person I hoped to find. Have you seen Miss Gifford?" The housekeeper blinked. "Not since the meeting. She went upstairs, said she needed time alone." Poirot nodded. "Merci." "And has the car remained in the garage?" Mrs. Ashcroft hesitated. "Yes, but I did find the side door unlocked a few minutes ago. I thought the wind had blown it." Poirot's eyes sharpened. He moved quickly to the service corridor that led to the garden, past the pantry, through the tiled utility hall. The door was ajar, the latch bruised by force. The wind tugged softly at the edge of the frame. Outside, faint footprints cut across the gravel path, leading not to the main road, but toward the woods behind the estate. Poirot stepped out into the cold. The sky was leaden, the air damp. He followed the tracks with care, each step precise. Penelope had not taken the driveway. She had gone where she would not be seen, and that meant she was not going to meet the police. She was going to disappear. 10 minutes into the woods, he found the fallen scarf, a silk blend, ivory and pale green, half buried in the wet leaves. He picked it up, then paused, listening, and heard it. A sharp rustle. Not wind. A figure ahead, moving fast, glancing over her shoulder. "Mademoiselle Gifford!" Poirot called, his voice firm, unwavering. The figure froze. Penelope turned slowly, her coat damp, her face streaked with rain and panic. In her right hand, clutched with white knuckles, was a small satchel, the kind just large enough to hold money, a passport, and a second life. "I should have known," she said bitterly. "You don't let go of anything, do you?" Poirot stepped closer. "It is not my duty to let go. It is my duty to see things through." She looked away. "There's nothing left to say." "But there is," he said gently. "You were not always cruel. You were not always afraid." "I never wanted to kill him," she muttered. "I only wanted to stop him. Just stop him." Poirot tilted his head. "So you planned the photo, but not the poison?" Penelope hesitated. "No, I planned both. Her breath caught. "I asked Knox for something. He dabbled in chemicals once, years ago, during some ridiculous investment into agricultural compounds. He knew of something that would work, something rare." Poirot's eyes flicked. "Knox supplied the poison. He didn't know what I intended," she said quickly. "I told him I needed something to put down an animal without mess, a dog. He gave me a vial. He never asked why." Poirot's voice softened. "You used it on Harold." She nodded once, eyes wet. "I thought I could make it look natural." He had been under stress. A heart episode, perhaps? No one would know. But then you came. And you ran. "I didn't want to rot in prison," she spat. Poirot sighed. "You were raised in privilege, mademoiselle, given every advantage. But privilege is no shield against consequence." Penelope wiped her face. "You always speak like a sermon." "No," he said. "I speak like a man who has seen many people ruin their souls for the wrong reasons." He stepped closer. "The police will be here within the hour. You have a choice: to be brought in from the trees like a fugitive, or to return with me and face what must come." Penelope looked up at the sky. Then finally, she dropped the satchel. They returned to the house in silence. No one met them at the door. No one needed to. When Penelope stepped back into the blue study, she did so not with dignity, but with resolve. She poured herself a brandy and said nothing as Poirot summoned the rest of the household. When they arrived, Lady Eugenia, Talbot, Knox, Lenora, Ashcroft, she simply stood and said, "I'm sorry." And it was the first thing she had said all week that felt honest. Knox turned pale. "What did you do?" "She used the vial you gave her," Poirot said quietly. "For a dog, you thought?" Knox sank into the chair, the weight of proximity to guilt settling in. Poirot faced them all. "The crime is no longer a mystery," he said, "but the damage remains. Harold Fielding died to uncover a truth. That truth will now be acknowledged." He looked to Lady Eugenia, whose face had turned ashen. "She is her father's daughter," the old woman said, almost a whisper. "She has his eyes." Poirot nodded. Tomorrow, the world will learn of Lenora's name, and the silence that killed a man will finally be broken. And in that silence, Penelope sat with her head bowed, not as a murderer any more, but as a woman finally undone. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The storm that had lingered for days finally broke that evening, not with thunder, but with a soft, relentless rain, gentle as remorse. Grange Hall, though quieter now, seemed no less burdened. Penelope remained in the small sitting room adjacent to the blue study, where Poirot had insisted she stay until the authorities arrived. She sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap. Her thoughts turned inward toward a future now reduced to steel bars and inked statements. But for Hercule Poirot, the case was not yet complete. Something still troubled him, a small inconsistency that had tugged at the edge of his mind like a loose thread on an otherwise well-tailored coat. The murder had been explained, the motive confirmed, the mechanism, poison through a photograph, revealed. And yet, one final detail eluded him. He stood once more in the blue study, alone now except for the quiet tick of the mantel clock. He examined the hearth, the bookshelves, the sideboard. His gaze settled again on the desk, the blotter with Fielding's last impressions, the untouched pen, the brandy glass. Poirot lowered himself slowly into the chair where Harold Fielding had taken his final breath. He placed his hand on the desk exactly as Fielding's must have. He reached out, carefully, mimicking the movement of someone discovering an envelope or a photograph. And then, very slowly, he reached toward the mantel clock, tilting it forward just 5 degrees. And there it was, a faint, dusty smudge, no longer wet but clear in the pattern it had left. Poirot drew out his handkerchief and dabbed at it. Then he brought the cloth to his nose. Almond, the same smell. He smiled, but not with triumph, with satisfaction. The detail had not been missing, only waiting to be noticed. Penelope had placed the poisoned photograph on the mantel, not on the desk, not in a drawer, but on the clock, just slightly askew. She had counted on Fielding's obsessive nature to notice it and correct it. She had known him well. That detail, an object just out of alignment, was too small for most to see but intolerable for a man like Harold. He would fix it reflexively, without question. He had. And it had killed him. Poirot exhaled. Et voilà. He made his way to Lady Eugenia's room next. He found her seated by the window in a straight-backed chair, her hands clasped before her, her profile unreadable against the gray window pane. She turned slightly as he entered but did not rise. "You found your final thread?" she asked. "I did." She nodded. "And my family?" "Is not destroyed," Poirot replied. "Damaged, yes, but not beyond repair." She gave a brittle smile. "You are kinder than I deserve." "I am not interested in what is deserved, madame. Only in what is true." He moved to stand beside her. "Lenora will be acknowledged, I presume." "She will," Eugenia said. "The paperwork is already being prepared. I may not have known about her before, but I will not deny her now. Not after this." Poirot studied her a moment longer, then bowed his head respectfully. "Then Harold Fielding did not die in vain." Eugenia's voice was very soft. "No, he died for truth, and that is never wasted." Poirot left her then. Downstairs, the police had arrived. A plain gray car parked discreetly outside the hall, 2 officers in raincoats speaking to Mrs. Ashcroft in low voices. Penelope was escorted out quietly. She offered no resistance, no final words, only a glance toward the photograph still resting on Poirot's desk. As the door closed behind her, the silence in the house grew deeper, but cleaner. Poirot returned to the drawing-room where Lenora now stood alone, gazing out at the sodden garden. She turned as he approached, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what happens now," she said. "You learn," Poirot said gently, "to live with a new name, a new truth, and to forgive a history that was written without your consent. Will I inherit Grange Hall? That," Poirot replied with a small smile, "is no longer my concern. But I suspect Lady Eugenia will do what is just. She's not as cold as she appears." Lenora looked back toward the window. "I don't know if I want it." "Then do not take it as inheritance," Poirot said. "Take it as memory, a place where the past has finally spoken." He let the words settle, then turned toward the fire. "You knew Harold truly cared for you." "Yes," she said quietly. "He told me once I was a question no one dared to answer. Now I think he was trying to become the answer himself." Poirot bowed his head. He succeeded. They sat together in silence for a time, neither needing to speak. Outside, the rain continued to fall, not harsh now, but cleansing. The manor, burdened for so long by secrets and silence, finally breathed again. Later that evening, Poirot prepared for his departure. His small suitcase was packed with meticulous care. His shoes shined, his mustache trimmed just so. Before he left, he returned once more to the blue study. He looked around the room, not at the scene of a crime, but at a puzzle completed. On the desk, he left a single white card. It read only, "Order has been restored. H.P." And with that, he stepped out into the misted world, his silhouette vanishing down the gravel path as quietly as it had arrived. Behind him, Grange Hall stood not just in silence, but in truth. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The halls of Grange Hall were quiet that morning, not the tense, breathless silence that had lingered in the days following Harold Fielding's death, but a silence that felt earned, cleansed, the kind of stillness left behind when something terrible has passed through and been named. Poirot had not planned to stay another night, yet Lady Eugenia insisted. A room had been prepared for him with the utmost care, and in the soft candlelight of the guest corridor, even Hercule Poirot found rest. When he awoke, the rain had finally stopped. Downstairs, breakfast was laid out in the conservatory, not the grand dining room, but the smaller, glass-walled corner where vines curled up over the beams, and the morning light softened the silverware. It was a place for confessions, not announcements, and so it was there, over warm tea and dry toast, that the household reassembled. One final time. Lady Eugenia sat at the head of the table, upright, composed. Colonel Talbot beside her, his military stiffness now tempered with something more human. Jasper Knox arrived late, slightly disheveled but no longer defiant. Mrs. Ashcroft, as always, moved like a steward of gravity, and Lenora, now seated opposite Lady Eugenia, bore a strange duality in her expression, uncertainty mixed with the beginning of resolution. Poirot entered last. The conversation halted as he approached, not out of fear, but anticipation. They were ready, or, at the very least, they were prepared to listen. He remained standing. "My friends," he began softly, "this house has witnessed a great crime, but also a greater truth. And now, as we gather here, not for accusation but for restoration, I shall speak the full story." He took a breath, his voice steady. Harold Fielding was murdered. Not by malice alone, but by fear of exposure, fear of losing power, fear of what one buried truth might unearth. Penelope Gifford, in her desperation, acted not only to protect her future, but to erase another's past. She placed the poisoned photograph on the mantelpiece of the blue study, knowing Harold would fix its misalignment. She knew his habits. She knew his eyes. The group remained silent. But Penelope did not act in a vacuum. Her actions were shaped by years of quiet entitlement, of living in a household that looked backward more than forward. The silence that allowed her to act was built long before she ever lifted a finger. He turned to Lady Eugenia. "Madame, you did not know about Lenora, but the systems you maintained, the ones that shrouded shame in formality, helped breed the crime." Eugenia inclined her head. "I do not deny it." Poirot looked at Lenora next. "You, mademoiselle, have been at the center of this mystery not by choice, but by blood. And though that blood brought tragedy, it also brought light. You were the question Harold Fielding tried to answer, even at the cost of his life." She met his gaze with quiet strength. Poirot stepped back slightly, his hands clasped. "I ask not for judgment, only understanding, and, if possible, peace." Lady Eugenia set down her teacup. "I've had legal papers drafted," she said, her voice formal, deliberate. "Lenora will be acknowledged as a legal heir to the Gifford estate. Her parentage will be made public through my office. No more hiding." The statement fell gently, like a curtain closing. Jasper Knox stirred. "And what of me?" Poirot looked at him carefully. "You supplied the poison." "Unknowingly, yes, but with negligence. I suspect the police will ask for a statement." Knox exhaled slowly. "I'll give one." Colonel Talbot cleared his throat. "And me, Poirot? I warned Harold to stop digging. Does that make me complicit?" "You acted out of loyalty," Poirot said. "Misplaced, perhaps, but not criminal. Though I trust you now see where silence can lead." The old soldier gave a slow nod. Mrs. Ashcroft remained quiet, but her eyes had softened. She looked at Lenora with something approaching maternal sorrow, an ache for what had been withheld and what might now be reclaimed. Poirot glanced around the table once more, then stepped away. "I shall be leaving after luncheon, but before I go, I have one final act to perform." He withdrew from his pocket a folded slip of paper. He handed it to Lenora. "What is it?" she asked. "The final letter Harold wrote. Found beneath the blotter in the blue study. The ink was faint, but I was able to recover it." She unfolded it with trembling hands and read silently, "To L. If you are reading this, then I have failed to tell you myself. But know this, your truth is not a scandal. It is a birthright. And no matter what the others say, your presence here is not a trespass. It is a return." She pressed the paper to her chest, her lips quivering. "Thank you," she whispered. Poirot bowed gently. "Do not thank me, mademoiselle. Thank the man who died so you might live fully." He turned to go. And as he stepped into the hallway once more, the house did not feel heavy anymore. The truth, now spoken, had done what it must, restored order, honored the dead, and given voice to those who had long been silenced. Hercule Poirot, having stitched the last thread of the tapestry, walked quietly toward the door, where the world beyond Grange Hall waited, wet and windswept and awake. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The train platform at Dunworthy Station was nearly empty. A pale mist clung to the low hedges beyond the tracks, and the air carried that particular silence known only to country mornings, the kind that exists between the rhythm of departing footsteps and the whistle of arrival. Poirot stood beneath the station's iron awning, suitcase in hand, gloves neatly folded beneath one arm, and watched a flock of birds rise and scatter across the horizon. His visit to Grange Hall had ended not in triumph nor drama, but in something far quieter: stillness. The murder had been solved. Justice, it seemed, was now a matter for the courts, and yet Poirot's thoughts remained heavy, as if some residue of the house's sorrow still clung to the fabric of his coat. He heard approaching footsteps, quick, hesitant. He turned. It was Lenora. She wore a slate gray coat and carried a small envelope in her hand. Her expression, though uncertain, had shed the veil of confusion she'd worn when they first met. Now she looked simply present, as if she had finally entered her own life. "I'm sorry," she said breathlessly. "I didn't mean to keep you." Poirot inclined his head. "On the contrary, mademoiselle, I am most pleased you came." She held out the envelope. "I thought you should see this. It arrived this morning by post. Addressed to me, but meant for you, I think." Poirot accepted it gently. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Harold Fielding's. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no more than a few lines. "Monsieur Poirot, if anything should happen to me, I trust your little gray cells will uncover what mine could not. There is more to Grange Hall than ledgers and bloodlines. The truth lies not in names, but in what people do to protect them." H. F. Poirot read it twice, then folded it with care. "Merci," he said softly. "I wanted you to know," Lenora added, "that I'll be staying at the Hall. Not to inherit," she said quickly, "but to learn, to understand the land, the people, the name." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then it will become your home, not by blood, but by choice. That, mademoiselle, is far more powerful." She looked down. "Do you think Penelope will ever recover from what she's done?" He considered. "There is no comfort in guilt," he said, "but there is growth, if she chooses to feel it." Lenora looked toward the horizon, where the train was just beginning to emerge from the fog. "She was always the strongest person I knew. I think, in a way, she still is." Poirot nodded, but said nothing more. The whistle blew in the distance, and the platform trembled softly beneath their feet. Lenora stepped back, offering her hand. "Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot, and thank you for everything." He took her hand gently. "It was never about finding a killer, mademoiselle. It was about restoring a life." She smiled, and then she was gone, disappearing into the mist back toward the estate that had once erased her, and now, at last, had welcomed her home. Poirot boarded the train and settled into his compartment. As the countryside slid past the window, green and gold and gray, he reflected once more on the intricate layers of the case. Harold Fielding had died not because of a single decision, but because of many, some made decades before. Penelope's crime had been the final blow, yes. But the deeper tragedy lay in how many hands had turned away from truth over the years, how many had chosen silence, secrecy, or the illusion of respectability over honesty. And yet, in the end, the truth had emerged. It always does. He opened his notebook, added one final line beneath the heading, "The Affair at Grange Hall," and then closed it with a small sigh. There were other trains to catch, other truths to untangle. But this mystery, at last, had reached its end, with justice served, identities reclaimed, and a name, Lenora Vale, spoken at last, no longer a question, but an answer. The train carried him away, gentle and steady, into the misty distance where even shadows dissolve. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The carriage that awaited Penelope Gifford at the edge of Grange Hall was a quiet reminder that justice, though inevitable, often arrives on wheels slower than the mind wishes. Her hands rested limply in her lap as the driver helped her inside, the damp air heavy with the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. The rain had finally ceased, leaving the world washed clean but raw. Penelope did not speak on the journey to Dunworthy. The fields blurred past the window, a green and brown smear, as if the landscape itself wished to forget the sorrow that had passed through this house. She stared down at her reflection in the glass, pale, lined with grief and remorse, and the ghost of a smile flickered before fading. At the police station, the formalities began. Questions were asked, statements recorded. Yet amidst the official proceedings, Penelope felt oddly detached, as if watching from outside herself. She understood now that her actions, born from fear and selfishness, had irrevocably altered the course of many lives, including her own. Meanwhile, at Grange Hall, life began its slow return to a fragile normalcy. Lady Eugenia, though visibly aged by the weight of recent events, summoned a strength Poirot admired. She had moved swiftly to arrange legal recognition for Lenora Vale, ensuring that the young woman's place in the family and the estate was secure. The tangled threads of past silence were being carefully woven into a new tapestry, one where truth would no longer be a hidden thing. Colonel Talbot, whose gruff exterior had softened over the days, resumed his role as guardian of the estate, though now tempered with the humility earned by witnessing the cost of pride and secrecy. Jasper Knox remained under scrutiny, his negligence a sobering lesson in responsibility. Though spared direct accusation in the murder, his complicity in supplying the poison left a stain difficult to wash away. Lenora herself navigated a path between the known and the unknown. Grange Hall was hers now in part, not merely through inheritance, but by the choice she made to claim it. She walked the gardens in the mornings, learning the names of plants and the stories they carried. She visited the archives in the afternoons, poring over documents that spoke of a family legacy as complex and beautiful as the land itself. One afternoon, as Poirot prepared to depart, he found Lenora by the rose arbor. The delicate petals glistened with fresh rain, their fragrance both sharp and sweet. "Will you miss this place?" he asked quietly. She smiled, eyes reflecting a new certainty. "I think I am only just beginning to know it." Poirot nodded, satisfied. "Remember," he said, "truth is not merely discovered, it is lived." Their farewell was brief but warm. Poirot boarded his carriage with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the investigation. As the wheels turned and the estate receded behind him, he allowed himself a small smile. Another mystery closed, another injustice righted. And as the country road stretched before him, veiled in soft twilight, Hercule Poirot's mind turned already towards the next enigma, the next puzzle, the next truth waiting patiently to be revealed. For the little gray cells never rest, and justice, no matter how delayed, always finds its way home. The rain had ceased, but the heavy clouds still loomed low over Grange Hall, casting the landscape in a muted gray that seemed to press down on the earth itself. Inside the estate, a peculiar quiet lingered, one not born of peace, but of secrets still unearthed, half glimpsed and half hidden in the shadowed corners of the house. Lenora sat alone by the window in the old library, her fingers tracing the delicate pattern of the lace curtain as her thoughts spiraled inward. The weight of her newfound heritage pressed heavily upon her, more than any legal document could express. She had stepped into a family legacy riddled with betrayal, lies, and long-buried sorrows. Yet she felt that what had been revealed was only the surface. Something deeper, something unseen, pulsed beneath the calm exterior of Grange Hall. Outside, the wind stirred the last fallen leaves of autumn, whispering secrets that no one seemed to heed. Lenora's eyes narrowed as she noticed a small envelope perched on the sill, its edges yellowed with age. It had not been there moments before. She picked it up with trembling hands and broke the fragile seal. Inside was a note, scrawled hastily in ink that had bled slightly into the paper. The hand that gripped nothing yet held everything is not the only one. Watch the shadows where the light falls twice. The message was cryptic, but it struck a chord deep within her. She read it again, trying to glean its meaning, when the creak of floorboards startled her. Turning quickly, she found Jasper Knox standing in the doorway, his face ashen. "You shouldn't be alone," he said, voice low. "This house, it's not as safe as it looks." Lenora folded the note carefully. "Who sent this?" Knox hesitated. "I don't know, but I've heard whispers. Someone else is watching, waiting. Someone who never wanted the truth to come out, no matter the cost." Her heart quickened. Penelope's arrest won't end this? No, this is bigger than her. Lenora's mind raced. What more had Harold Fielding uncovered? What secret could be so perilous that it demanded silence beyond a single murder? She knew the answer lay somewhere in the depths of Grange Hall, hidden in the letters never sent, in the faces not painted, in the footsteps no one remembered. Later that evening, Poirot returned from his brief respite at the station. He sensed immediately the tension in the air, the subtle but unmistakable tremor beneath the veneer of calm. Gathering the household once again, he spoke with measured gravity. "There is a thread we have yet to follow," he said. "A presence, unseen but felt. A player who watches from the darkness, whose motives are still concealed." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The letter found by Mademoiselle Vale is a summons, a warning. Someone wishes to remind us that this story is not yet finished." Lady Eugenia's eyes darkened. "You believe there is another?" "Oui, madame. And this one is more cautious, more dangerous." Poirot revealed a small collection of papers he had obtained that day from a hidden compartment in the desk. A series of unsigned letters, each veiled in menace and desperation, hinting at threats made long ago but never acted upon. They speak of debts owed, of alliances broken, and of blood that cannot be cleansed with words alone. As he spoke, Penelope entered the room unexpectedly. She was pale but composed, her presence unsettling the group. Eyes turned sharply toward her. "I came to warn you all," she said softly. "There is one among you who will not stop until the past is buried again, in blood if necessary." A stunned silence followed. "Penelope," Poirot said carefully, "you speak as one who has seen the beast's claws." She nodded. "Because I have." Her gaze locked with Lady Eugenia's. "The night Harold died, I was not alone in my desperation. Someone helped me. Someone who feared Lenora's claim more than I did." The room held its breath. "I cannot say who, for fear of my own safety, but I know this. The true enemy is still here." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Then we must watch, listen, and wait." The house, once a sanctuary of inherited wealth and whispered lies, had become a labyrinth of shadows and hidden footsteps. every door closed with the sound of a secret kept. Every glance was a veiled question. That night, as the wind howled through the trees and the rain returned in soft drumming, Lenora sat by her window once more, the mysterious note clutched in her hand. Outside, the darkness was no longer simply absence of light. It was a presence, waiting, watching, holding its own mysteries close. And in the depths of Grange Hall, the unseen thread was pulling tighter. The game was far from over. Chapter 18. The closing remark. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the rolling hills of Somerset, casting long, golden shadows across the manicured lawns of Grange Hall. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and roses freshly washed by the rain. Inside the great house, peace had finally settled. A fragile peace, born from truths spoken and secrets laid bare. Hercule Poirot stood in the grand drawing-room one last time, his gaze sweeping across the faces of those who remained. Lady Eugenia, dignified though softened by grief. Lenora, poised with the quiet strength of one who had reclaimed her past. Colonel Talbot, weathered but resolute. And even Jasper Knox, subdued by consequence. Penelope Gifford was no longer among them, escorted to face the justice her actions demanded. Poirot's voice, measured and calm, filled the room. Mes amis, this affair has tested many things, loyalties, courage, and the strength of the human heart. We have witnessed how silence, when worn as armor, can become a prison, and how fear, when left unchecked, can drive even the noblest to acts most regrettable. He paused, fingers lightly clasped. Yet, it is not only the past that shapes us, but the choices we make in the light of truth. Lenora Vale's journey is a testament to this, a daughter once hidden, now embraced, a life reclaimed not merely by blood, but by the courage to face what was buried. A soft smile crossed his lips, his eyes twinkling with that subtle mischief Poirot was known for. Justice, my friends, is not always swift, nor is it always gentle, but it is inevitable, like the turning of the seasons or the setting of the sun. It comes for us all, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a roar, and when it does, we must be ready to meet it with grace. He turned toward the window, watching as the last light faded. Grange Hall will remember this time, not as a moment of shame, but as a moment of awakening. For it is in acknowledgment of truth, however painful, that we find the possibility of renewal. Poirot then faced the assembled once more, his voice softening to a personal reflection. I depart now, leaving you with a thought as enduring as the stones of this house. People often think the greatest mysteries lie in the shadows, but sometimes the deepest secrets hide in the light, masked by everyday smiles, by the routines we cling to, and by the stories we tell ourselves. He gave a final nod, a gentle bow, and with that, mes amis, I take my leave. May you walk forward with clear eyes and quiet hearts. The room remained silent as Poirot gathered his belongings. He paused at the door, looking back one last time, not as an intruder, but as a guardian of truths. Outside, the evening breeze stirred the leaves, carrying the promise of new beginnings. And as the great doors closed behind him, the little gray cells that had unraveled the tangled threads of the affair at Grange Hall rested, if only briefly, ready to awaken again at the next whisper of a mystery. The fading light of day softened the heavy stones of Grange Hall as Hercule Poirot stood once more before the assembled household. The air was thick with the weight of revelations past, and the fragile hope of truths finally spoken. Around him, faces reflected every shade of emotion, relief, regret, sorrow, and a tentative peace. Poirot's eyes, sharp and luminous behind his neatly trimmed mustache, swept the room slowly. He spoke with measured grace, his voice calm yet carrying the unmistakable weight of finality. Mes amis, the threads of this tale have been tangled with care, but today they are drawn tight. We have seen how silence can shroud the deepest wounds, how fear may drive even the gentlest to darkness. Yet, as the light enters these halls, so too must understanding. He paused, allowing the moment to settle. The truth we have uncovered is not merely about a name, a document, or even a murder. It is about the choices we make when faced with our own shadows. Lenora Vale, now rightfully embraced as part of this family, embodies the courage to claim a stolen past and walk boldly into the future. Poirot's gaze softened as it met Lenora's. Her journey reminds us that justice is not always swift, but it is persistent. It may demand sacrifice, confession, and change, but it always seeks to restore balance. He turned gently to Lady Eugenia. "Madame, your grace in accepting this new chapter will set the course for those who follow. For it is not the blood alone that binds a family, but the willingness to face truth without falter." Lady Eugenia inclined her head with dignity, a quiet acknowledgment of the path ahead. Poirot addressed the rest with warmth, tinged with the wisdom of experience. Let this be a lesson that even the most carefully constructed facades cannot withstand the persistence of honesty, and that the little gray cells, when devoted to justice, will always find their way. He stepped toward the door, a faint smile touching his lips. "I depart now, but not without gratitude, for your patience, your truths, and your hopes." At the threshold, Poirot glanced back once more, a final thought lingering in the air. In mysteries, as in life, it is often not the loudest voices that reveal the deepest secrets, but the quietest moments of courage. May you all find peace in that knowing. And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped into the twilight, leaving Grange Hall behind, a house no longer burdened by shadows, but standing steadfast in the dawn of a new day.